which led to the Prime Minister's downfall. I'll be speaking to one of the economists who warned Liz Truss of the dangers. Boris Johnson could join the race to succeed her. What lessons can the next Prime Minister learn? Also ahead, businesses call for stability as they brace for higher interest rates and rising energy bills. And government borrowing hits £20 billion in September as inflation pushes up interest payments. Good morning, this is Ian King Live and our business and economic news from the heart of the city. Well, Liz Truss will go down as the shortest serving Prime Minister in British history after the spectacular failure of her economic experiment. A £45 billion package of unfunded tax cuts led to the pound falling to its lowest level against the US dollar on record, a sharp rise in gilt yields and emergency intervention by the Bank of England. It's now emerged that Liz Truss ignored warnings from senior economists about the potential consequences of her so-called mini-budget. One of them was Gerard Lyons, Chief Economic Strategist at NetWealth, who joins me now. Gerard, welcome to you. So you warned Liz Truss that she risked crashing the markets. Do you think if she'd listened to you, she'd still be in her job?
Ian, good morning. It's great to be on the show. Yes, there was a news story in The Guardian today that related to a meeting where she and Pratt, before they had gone into Downing Street, had invited in some outside economists. And at that meeting, and indeed without giving any secrets away, it was something I was saying publicly in my comments at the time. It was necessary for any new policy actions to actually stick to what the markets expected. At that time, everyone was expecting the statement to be a fiscal event where they merely outlined what had been unveiled in the campaign, namely the energy levy and reversing the 2 tax increases. Anything beyond that needed to wait for a proper budget, needed to be fully costed. In terms of the answer to the second half of the question, clearly the economic backdrop was a key part of how things have unfolded, but the politics as well need to be considered, and I can't really comment on that. But certainly they didn't get the economics right, despite, I would say, as Tony Blair actually said last week, she probably identified the right problem, the need to turn the growth picture around in the UK, but clearly it was executed very poorly.
As it stands, Gerard, we've got a fiscal statement due on the 31st of October. Would it be wise, in your view, to postpone that so the new Prime Minister has had a chance to look at the books and have a think about what they want to do?
Well, this is a very interesting point, because from the market's perspective, sooner is better. And from the market's perspective, it's quite clear what needs to be done, regardless of who is in number 10, never mind in number 11. From a political perspective, though, there's a very different dimension. Inflation has already caused havoc in some respects with the government's finances. It's actually given a big plus on the revenue side, but on the expenditure side, it's squeezed real budgets. Spending in real terms, taking into account inflation, is less than expected. Now, if on top of that, 13 to 35 billion pounds of spending cuts, then clearly departments need to be considered. But from an economic and the market perspective, coming back to your question, it would probably send the wrong message, the wrong signal to postpone that event at the end of October. But again, it highlights the fact that all the components of the budget not only need to be fully costed, but there's a political dimension as well as the economic/market dimension.
And then, of course, you mentioned the market dimension. The very next day, the Bank of England is due to start QT, selling down some of its stock of assets.
Yeah, well, personally, I don't think the Bank of England should be engaging in quantitative tightening. I think the real challenge here with monetary policy is 2 wrongs do not make a right. Last year, it was wrong for the Bank of England not to be raising rates and at the same time to be easing policy through quantitative easing. It was quite clear at the beginning of last year, inflation was rising and the economy would cope with policy tightening. But that is not corrected by having a wrong now, which in my view is to actually engage in quantitative tightening, selling gilts into a market that's already got a lot of debt to absorb, and also the danger about the fact that they could overdo it on monetary policy and interest rates, as indeed was alluded to by a speech by one of the deputy governors the other day. But no doubt the key issue in the UK is the fact that the markets felt that fiscal policy needed to be shown to be affordable. But at the same time, often overlooked in recent weeks, the markets quite correctly said that inflation needed to be nipped in the bud if possible, and that the Bank of England has clearly been behind the curve. So we've got a very difficult backdrop here. I think the Bank of England should be raising interest rates, but I don't think they should be engaging in quantitative tightening.
It was very interesting. We had a speech yesterday from Ben Broadbent, the Deputy Governor of the Bank, in which he indicated very strongly that he thought market expectations for where bank rate peaks in this cycle were too high. Did you take comfort from that?
Look, Ben Broadbent and the other deputy governor of the bank should be reassuring the markets that they're going to get on top of inflation. That's the key message they need to be getting across. But quite clearly, the scale of the tightening really depends on many factors. And I've said for some time, the speed, the scale, and the sequencing. The sequencing in terms of what they do on quantitative tightening and on interest rates needs to be very sensitive to the economy's performance. As we saw with pension funds recently, which was a problem waiting to happen, basically many parts of the financial system have become used to very cheap money. The challenge is that parts of the real economy also have become very used to cheap money, notably the property sector. So Broadbent is right about the fact that the markets and the economy will be very sensitive to higher interest rates. But I think he shouldn't be indicating where rates will be peaking. I think he should be reassuring, as in America, where the Fed is doing it right, need to be reassuring the markets and the general public that inflation will be controlled and start to decelerate.
Now, received wisdom has it that the Chancellor and indeed the new Prime Minister will have very little room for manoeuvre from here on in. They've got to put up taxes, they've got to cut public spending and so forth. Does it have to be like that in your view?
Right, I think it's very important to stress this, that debt to GDP in the UK is high, but it's manageable. But what happens when debt to GDP is high? It makes the fiscal outlook very dependent on your assumptions about growth and also on the outlook for interest rates. And hence the relationship between growth and interest rates is key. If you assume growth is too low and will be very low, then it means you end up either raising taxes too much or cutting spending too much, and it's like being in a hole and digging deeper. Of course, interest rates going up doesn't give them much room for manoeuvre. But coming back to your question, I think the scale of tightening we're now seeing might be overdoing it. But there's no doubt that we've got to a situation where stability has taken centre stage, and that's unfortunately, in some people's eyes, taking too much of a centre stage. But as someone looking at it from the market's perspective, I'm saying, well, stability has to now be the issue that's addressed. And therefore, coming back to your question, it could result in fiscal policy being tightened too much, particularly on the spending side. If one assumes, just a little bit further, for instance, when the IFS did their recent growth projection, or fiscal outlook, it was based on the growth projection from Citibank of minus 0.7% for growth next year. The IMF was saying growth next year could be 0.3%. Others have slightly higher figures. If you assume basically 0.75% higher growth over the next few years, that fiscal hole disappears. I'm not saying there's not a fiscal hole.